Thank you, Chavi, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you guys today. What I want to talk to you about today is a couple of new tools that are designed to help improve resilience through the process of enabling more effective risk management. So we'll spend a lot of time setting the stage for the topic of risk management. And so I'm going to start this way. Everyone knows what this is. This is an iceberg. Everyone knows what this is. That's a ship. When ships meet icebergs, it typically turns out badly for the ship. But I'm going to put that in the context of risk. So we're not going to call this an iceberg. We'll call it a riskberg. And we won't call this a ship. We'll call it a pig farm. So when risks meet pig farms, in similar fashion, risks sink pig farms. It typically doesn't turn out well for a risk realized on a pig farm. So the question for us is, are we really aware, how aware are we of the risks that we face on pig farms? So to talk about that, I want to split risk management into kind of four categories. One is the known knowns. The second is the known unknowns. The third would be the unknown knowns. And the fourth would be the unknown unknowns. Now, the known knowns would be those risks that we know about and at least to some degree understand. An example of that might be positive pigs that enter a negative farm. The known unknowns would be the things that we can name as potential risks, but we don't quite understand, or at least understand as fully as we need to. An example of that might be area spread of virus. An example of an unknown known might be the risks that we have at least some sort of information about, but we really haven't pulled together all the pieces that we need to know how best to take action on. And one of the examples of that might be imported product risks, like feedstuffs coming on barges across the Pacific to North America. An example, unknown unknowns, would be the unexpected, unanticipated risks that when we realize those risks, they have a very profound, high-cost, damaging impact on our operations when they happen. And an example of that might be new viral variant emergence in a country or an area or a region. Sometimes the risks are quite large. Sometimes the risks are small or a combination of large and small risks. Sometimes the risks are more visible than others. I don't know how well you can see on the right side of the slide, but inside the circle here is an iceberg. It's just hard to visualize, and there's a ship actually here as well that is approaching this iceberg. Sometimes the risks are hard to recognize until it's too late. Now, if we're going to effectively manage risk, in other words, effectively recognize or see risk, we have to be able to measure them. You've heard the old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure. It's just as true for risk as it is any other type of measurement. And if we're going to effectively manage risks, we also have to be able to effectively differentiate levels of risk. Is the risk we face low, moderate, high? If we're going to effectively manage risk, we have to be able to measure how effectively we reduce risk. And if we're going to effectively manage risk and measure it, we have to understand how best it helps us prevent the consequences of those risks. When you boil it all down, effective risk management, the end goal of effective risk management isn't just helping us make decisions, it's does it help us make better decisions? So what do we need to know about risk to make better decisions? Something that's fairly straightforward to know is the impact of the risk. Every time that you experience a risk, the consequence of a risk, it's fairly straightforward mathematical exercise to say, well, it affected us to this degree on aborts and pruning mortality and average daily gain, feed conversion, treatment costs. Those types of calculations are quite straightforward. The one that's not as clear is what's the probability of risk? What's the likelihood of experiencing the consequence of this risk if we face it? But the combination of those two factors, the consequence, impact, the probability or the likelihood of the risk, combine into how serious is that risk. So it's the probability times the impact. And so the combination of that represented by seriousness, it could be low, medium, high, or extremely high. This is the key part of this matrix that we need to understand better. What's the probability or the likelihood of the risks that we face? So now what I want to do is talk about context. When we talk about tools, we need to place them in a context. And I really like this quote by a Finnish architect named L.L. Saarinen. He said this, he said, "Always design a thing by considering it in its next larger context. A chair in a room in a house in an environment, and an environment in a city plan." So we're going to take the tools that we're going to talk about today and place those in their context. So the context that we're going to use is the five-step process. The five-step process is: what are your goals? What's your current status? What are the things or the constraints that keep you from achieving your goals? Defining those, understanding those. What are the options that you could put in place to help you achieve those goals? So what are the various options? There might be several that you can come up with. And then the fifth step is pick the one that looks optimal, pick the one that looks like it would be best, and then implement and monitor the execution of that solution. The five-step process has its origins in what's called the DMAIC process of Six Sigma. And the steps line up perfectly with the DMAIC process: define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. So we'll put our tools in the context of the five-step process. COMPAT, the risk assessment tool, fits best with the second and the third step in the five-step process, and then the P-TRACK, the second tool we'll talk about, fits with the third, fourth, and fifth steps of the five-step process. So, COMPAT, risk assessment. I'll give you a little history on risk assessment from the BI standpoint. A number of years ago, back in fall of 2002, in the US, we whiteboarded a PERS risk assessment tool. The reason we did that is because we were starting to look at some initiatives to look at system-level PERS management, and we were looking at some initiatives to do area regional control approaches to PERS management. And so we needed some tools to help us understand risks at a flow, system, and an area region network type level. So to help us craft a tool to better understand transmission circulation and clinical breaks at those levels, we whiteboarded it. This is the screenshot of, this was in my office in Ames, and we started relatively simple. We had columns that represented areas of high, medium, and low risk, and as you look at the rows across here, those basically were the risk factors, and so then each column, high, medium, low, were the levels of risk. We even attempted to craft some crude, what do we want the results to look like? And so that, we'll call that version 0 of the risk assessment. Then we took that tool and put it in a spreadsheet format. On the left is the version 1. Then we did some work, refined it, and created a version tool with the assistance of Daryl Holtkamp, who at that time was consulting with us and later joined Iowa State University faculty. The basic survey itself on the left is set up here, where all of these rows represent the risk factors, and then again the columns represent the levels of risk. And we did a number of things to put this format together, including talking to the poultry industry, looking at actuarial sciences, seeing what was done in other areas, both on the human and the animal health side that was out there. We found some useful things in the poultry industry. And then on the right, we wanted to represent the risk and something that you could visualize, look at, and take action on quickly. And so we decided to use a Pareto type format for that. And then the other format that we used at that time was to put it in a scatter plot so that we could represent internal risk on the x-axis, external risk on the y-axis, and then these lines here were floating according to the median or the 50th percentile of the risk for the external and the internal axis, respectively. So we took that version 1 tool, did a number of risk assessments, in this case 320 on a number of US farms, and we saw a relationship between risk score and the number of PERS breaks that these farms reported over the 3 years just prior to having done the risk assessment. So that was promising. Another thing that we did is work with some producers who did annual risk assessments on their farms. This particular example happens to be one producer. There's actually 12 farms here. They did annual risk assessments over a 4-year period, and based on those risk assessments, they took action. They might have made some management changes. They might have made some capital investments in things like truck washes, truck dryers. And then they also recorded the breaks that they experienced over that period of time. And so what I'm going to do is show you the 4-year progression from 2005 through 2008 of what that looks like. And so I want you to pay attention to these red diamonds as we kind of go through the years. So 2005, 2006, 2007, and 2008. And if I back up, you can see that two things happen. In the first year or two, internal risk is reduced from left to right, or from right to left, sorry. But the main thing that happens is that the external risk is reduced from top. It goes from top to bottom over that 4-year time period. So 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008. Now, other than just interesting looking graph, that doesn't really mean a lot until you equate it to, does it help you reduce your PERS breaks? And so the chart on the left represents the external risk score that was reduced over a period of 4 years for the 12 farms. And what we see on the black line is the break rate for a 2-year period. So this would be break rate for 2004 and 5, 5 and 6, so it's a rolling break rate, 6 and 7, 7 and 8. And we see that the number of breaks over a 2-year period is reduced by about 50%, attributable to the actions that were taken for risk reduction based off of the assessments that they did over a repeated number of years. Another project that we did is we worked with Paul Yeske at Swine Vet Center. Paul had set up a study to look at survival of PERS-negative herds from either startups or depop repops. And so we worked with Paul on that study and applied the risk assessment to that data, and that is again, the red diamonds that you see in the matrix. And so I want to orient you to the next survival charts that we'll look at here. We're using the horizontal median to differentiate high versus low external risk. So above that median value represents high external risk, and below that median value represents low external risk. And so we'll look at the survival curves now. So just for perspective, over here, above median, high risk, below median, low risk. And in the survival curve, what was seen is that farms that were classified as above median risk, only 2 out of 12 farms survived as PERS negative out to 150 weeks. So 2 out of 12, or 17%. 50% of the farms survived for 150 weeks where they were in this category, the low-risk category. Now, 50% might not seem that good, but these farms were all in northern Iowa, southern Minnesota. So they're in very hog-dense areas and very high-risk areas typically. Even those farms that broke, did better in terms of how long they survived. So what we're looking at here is of the farms that broke, what was the weeks of average survival time? So those that were high risk, above the median, survived on average 42 weeks, less than a year. Those that were in the low risk category or below the median survived for 66 weeks, so 50% longer survival, even if they broke. Paul had done some work on depop repops, looking at the break-even period for a depop repop to be about 18 months. And so we looked at our data in that context. We said, okay, if it takes 18 months to do a break-even, are you better off being low risk in terms of recovery of your break-even, getting to your break-even point for depop repop versus those that are in the higher risk category? And what we found is that 74% of the low-risk farms survived at least to 18 months and achieved the break-even point for depop repop, whereas 17% of the high-risk farms did as well. So even if you do break, there's still advantages to doing what you can to mitigate your risk, particularly in this case, your external risk. So we gifted risk assessment to the ASV. The ASV has operated the risk assessment for a number of years. ASV is discontinuing the risk assessment in the beginning of July of this year. And the next generation of risk assessment is going to be much more real-time and active, but we're still a ways away from that. So, specifically now to the tool, the combat tool. And remember, it mainly works in the second and third step of the 5-step process. So for combat, what is combat? Combat is a survey-based risk assessment tool that helps more objectively measure risk, define risk so that you have a better chance to evaluate, manage, and mitigate risks that you face, and in turn, better prevent production and financial consequences of those risks. There's 55 questions in the combat risk assessment, split up into 4 categories. 15 internal risk questions, internal circulation risk questions, 20 related to external introduction risk, 7 that are specifically focused on location-based risk. Location risks are typically the ones that it's difficult to do anything about. You can't just pick up your farm and move it somewhere else, or at least not without substantial capital investment. And then the 4th category would be those related to management and pig flow risk. And so the scores for these various responses for the risk questions, it's a weighted risk calculation based on some published literature as well as other assessments that have been done by BI veterinarians over the last period of time. So visualization of the combat output. So on the x-axis, that represents the internal risk from low to high. On the y-axis, external risk from low to high. The circles in the scatter plot, the color represents degrees of location risk. The closer it gets to red, the higher the location risk. The closer it gets to green, the lower the location risk. And then the size of the circle represents the management and pig flow risks. So if you think about the circle size, a larger circle means higher management type risk. In other words, poorer risk management. The color of the circle, red, indicates that the location risk is high. And it's an important relationship between the size of the circle and the color of the circle. Because if you think about effective pig management and pig flow, those behaviors are quite important to managing, things that we can do to manage and mitigate risk on farms. And so if you have a red circle, you want the circle to be as small as possible. Because the location risk, the color, you're less able to do things about that. But you certainly can do things about the management risk. So you want to, if you have red circles in particular, you want to shrink the size of that circle. The combat tool can be used for benchmarking purposes, whether it's within your system, so all of these represent farms within a particular system, or if you want to compare it across the larger database, the overall database or subsets of that, areas, regions, countries, multiple systems, and so on. Now, using the results, you can sit down with producers and talk about here's what was red, here's what was big, circles. These are the things that we can do something about, and then formulate action plans, prioritize what actions to take first, as well as in the execution of those action plans, use those to help guide improvements by setting up training programs with the workers out in the farms, as well as at a management level, help the leadership of the pig producers, pig production systems to make better informed investment decisions based off of their risk profile and the specific high target risks. To get started with combat, it's quite easy. Just going to the App Store on Apple or Google Store, or in China, the Android Store. And the survey is currently in 9 different languages, I believe that represents. So quite easy to get started. So now we'll move on to the second tool, PTrack. Some context and background for PTrack. We'll start here. Over the last several centuries, we've gone through various industrial revolutions. We're currently in what would be called the fourth industrial revolution. The fourth industrial revolution is made up of smart automation, cloud connectedness, and what we'll call self-learning. And when we say self-learning, it's not us learning. It's the machine, or the machine's learning through a process of artificial intelligence. So that's what's called the fourth industrial revolution. And you see up here, under fourth revolution is a term called cyber-physical systems. Cyber-physical systems are the key building block to the fourth industrial revolution. And they involve things like data capture technologies, which are made up of hardware, software combinations, data synthesis and management approaches, which are software, cloud infrastructure, big data based, analytics and visualization, which includes things like machine learning and artificial intelligence. But all of that is intended to generate results that give you decision-ready, actionable information. Currently, we spend a lot of time on the analytics side. We spend time looking at data, looking at screens, looking at graphs, looking at reports, and go through a process of synthesizing all that information and trying to distill it down into information that can help us make decisions. But if there's ways, and there are ways through these cyber-physical systems to get to the decision-ready, actionable information much more quickly. Related to cyber-physical systems, specifically in the livestock arena, is something called precision livestock farming. Precision livestock farming is basically the production livestock version of cyber-physical systems. And in this graphic, you see here the sensors, that is the physical part of the cyber-physical system in precision livestock farming, coming into the cyber part, which is the software, the apps, the web interface, the cloud infrastructure. And all of that is intended to feed information into the producer, the workers on the farm, so that then they can make the decisions and take actions much more quickly. Another concept that I want to just briefly touch on is called jobs to be done, because both PTrack and Compass are tools that need to do jobs. And so this is a concept that was described through some research by someone called Clayton Christensen at Harvard, and described really well in a book called Competing Against Luck. So what is jobs to be done? Jobs to be done is a very simple premise, is that all of us, we don't buy products just to buy products. We hire products to do a job. And the classic example is the example of a drill. We don't buy a drill just to have a drill. We buy a drill to drill holes. So drilling holes is the jobs to be done. And we hire the drill to drill the holes. So the jobs to be done think about combat and PTRAC in that context, about what jobs we're hiring them to do. And again, in the context of the 5-step process, PTRAC targets the 3rd step, 4th step, and 5th step of the 5-step process. So what is PTRAC? PTRAC is essentially a cyber-physical system, part of a cyber-physical system for precision livestock farming type technology, and it's designed to help manage internal risks better. So why would you use PTRAC? Well, if you think about farms as castles, you have walls and moats that represent the biosecurity type of approaches that you need to put in place to keep diseases out. But for those diseases that you already have or that find their way into the farm, PTRAC is a tool to help you better manage the transmission and circulation for things that you have or that you need to get prepared for. You may not have them yet, but you need to get prepared for. So what makes PTRAC work? One of the key components to PTRAC is a Bluetooth beacon. These beacons are placed in a location. They emit a signal that has a range, so we'll call that a zone. They're battery-powered, these beacons, to last several years. And when farm personnel enter that zone with either a smart device that has the PTRAC app or a beacon detection device called a tracker on the left, the device detects the presence of the beacon. So those beacons are attached in locations you can see here on the cartoon on the wall. The person has, in this case, a smart device with the app. So the beacons are emitting their signals in their zone. The idea is to place enough beacons so that you cover the entire farm. And so then the smart device detects the beacon. It transmits the detection event of that beacon up to the cloud, and then the cloud system connects the person with the beacon and the location in terms of the time it enters the zone and the time that the smart device, the person, leaves the zone. All beacons are set up during a process of implementation, so they're placed and mapped within the farm site. The site is set up in the web software with risk zones, so you would define in the setup process as what represents higher risk versus moderate risk versus lower risk within the farm. And so then movements are tracked zone to zone, and then as need be, based on the risk level of the movements, the risk alerts are sent out as needed to the worker, to the worker's manager, to the unit manager, and others within that system. So just to give an example, typically an image is taken using Google Earth of the site. The site is then mapped, and then the risk zones are categorized based on the locations within the farm. And then as it's implemented, the risk movements are all mapped from no risk to low, medium, high, and very high. And then the opportunity to focus in and zero in on certain risks, in this case, the high and very high risks, is presented. More of the detail of this will get covered in the workshops this afternoon. And then various ways to represent the information in terms of breaking down the risks and different ways to depict and visualize these risks. So PTRAC is designed to support better management of disease agent circulation within farms, also real-time analysis and management of farm personnel movements. So it could not just necessarily a risk management tool, but a operational management tool. And it's also designed to enable an awareness of personnel on, am I in the right place? Am I making the right move? Just kind of a second check on if they're doing things that increase or reduce circulation risk within a farm. Some of the next steps for PTRAC represent looking at tracking other assets, so power washers, mortality carts, workstations that you would use in farrowing, supply carts, and that sort of thing. So just to conclude, Combat and P-TRAC are both two types of tools that fit within the precision livestock area, designed to help better manage PRRS risks that you face. The use of those tools in conjunction with or in the context of the 5-step process can enable both better decision making and support sustainable long-term profitability over the long run. So with that, I'll conclude. I have only gone 12 seconds over, and thank you.